All right, well, it is the third Sunday night of the month, and that means it is question and answer night, where we answer questions, address things that are left in the box by the members. And tonight's question, the question submitted was, explain Genesis 6 regarding sons of God, which I guess that's technically not a question, that's a command for me to explain something, but okay. Yes, I can do that. There, we're all done. Now we can leave. All right? No, not really. I assume that the passage they are referring to is this small text at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6. More specifically in verses 1 through 4, since that's the segment that's generated all of the contention. And I'll just go ahead and begin by reading the text in question. It came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. All right, now this text has generated a little bit of disagreement in the history of interpretation, so much so that there are many brethren whom I love and respect and think are very, very smart who disagree about how to read this passage. And I have a very definite view on it, and so I'm obviously going to come across as biased, but I guess to start with, my preliminary thought is, the thing that everybody can agree on is that what's happening here is bad. That the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men is something that's not supposed to happen and contributes to the multiplying wickedness on the earth. If you keep reading, it says, The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth. Every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. All right, so whatever is going on, verses 1 through 4, must have something to do with that. It's not like, Moses sat down to write Genesis and say, and today we're going to be telling you random facts that have nothing to do with each other. The sky is blue, and mankind was being bad. And, well, no, that's not what's happening. He talks about this instance of the sons of God intermarrying with the daughters of men. And as a result, there is great corruption on the earth. Or at least in connection with it, there is great corruption on the earth. And, well, that leads to the flood. It's a bad situation. Now, that's where people agree. Where people disagree is just who the sons of God even are in the first place. And there are, we could probably rehearse a whole litany of views. I read a book one time where it talked about space aliens. We're not going to, as cool as I think it is to find space alien theories in the Bible, we're probably not going to deal with that too much this evening. There's two views that really warrant serious attention. One is that, the sons of God and the daughters of men are both humans. And some people try to make that a little more specific and say that the sons of God are more specifically the descendants of Seth, while the daughters of men are specifically the descendants of Cain. You don't have to, but not everybody thinks that particularly about it. But it's basically the idea is that all of these people involved are humans. The other view, I'll just say right now, the view that I take is that the sons of God are angels and the daughters of men are human women, and that angels are intermarrying with human women to produce these Nephilim. Now some people hear that and they go, how can you believe such a thing? Well, we'll talk about it, and we'll talk about the evidence for it, some of the common objections to it, and if, again, this is it's supposed to be a little more open forum. I hopefully we can have some good discussion about it if people have questions as we go through this. If somebody asks a question and it's like way further down my outline, I'm going to say, that's way further down my outline, we'll get to it. But if you ask something that's not on here, we can address it from there. One thing I think we need to avoid is arguments from incredulity. When you use the phrase, that's ridiculous, and you don't give any reason why it's ridiculous, that's not really a valid argument. That's just incredulity. I mean, we could say that about anything. And the other thing I think, and I see this a lot, is people who say, well, we can't possibly know what it means, so we should never talk about it. Which is all fine and dandy, but the problem is this is a passage in the Bible, and we should at least, if it's in the Bible, we should at least talk about it. But there's some brethren who have this kind of allergic reaction. Anytime angels come into the discussion, any discussion of angels at all is automatically considered speculative. That's the spirit world. We can't comprehend it. Secret things belong to God. Well, no, the mere mention of angels doesn't automatically render a passage so mysterious and so magical that no mere mortal could possibly comprehend it this side of eternity. Try to understand what it says first. Now there are three basic things that I'll just kind of break it down in a three-part outline here. First of all, of course, there's the terminology. Second, we need to consider context. And normally, when we talk about the meanings of words, and then we talk about the larger context, we're talking about how we understand what a passage means. That's the rule of interpretation in any text that we're dealing with. But in this case, there's a third line of evidence I want to look at as well, which is New Testament quotes / allusions, and I believe that the balance really tips on item number 3. For starters, let's talk about terminology. The expression sons of God is actually a very common expression in the Bible, it turns out. We know quite a bit about what this phrase sons of God means. For instance, in the book of Job, the expression is used several times in the prologue of Job to refer to what are obviously angelic beings. In Job chapter 1, in verse 6, there came a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also was among them. Job 2 and verse 1, again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself to the Lord. Job 38 and verse 7 also talks about the sons of God singing for joy at the start of creation. So there's that element as well. Now there are some people who try to make the passages in Job and the sons of God in Job not be talking about angels because they don't want Genesis 6 to be talking about angels. I'm not going to get into that too much, except it doesn't make sense to say that Job 1 is talking about righteous humans whom Satan just happens to show up in the middle of. That approach does not really make much sense of the text at all. There's also a place in the New Testament where the expression sons of God seems to be equivalent with angels. That's in Luke chapter 20. Yeah, it's a good question, right? That is a good question. Why wasn't Job there? So that's a roadblock to that as well. Luke chapter 20, Jesus is talking, and this is a passage everybody goes to try to disprove the angel's view. And we'll deal more with it later. But in Luke chapter 20, in verse 36, he talks about those who attain to the resurrection, who are neither married nor given in marriage. Verse 36, for they cannot even die anymore because they are like angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. So there's an instance where sons of God and angels seems to be used with a little bit of interchange there as well. Now, there are also places in both the Old Testament and the New Testament where the phrase sons of God refers to people who are of the covenant people of God. Deuteronomy chapter 14, although it's not the exact phrase, there is a passage in Deuteronomy 14 where Moses says that you are the sons of the Lord your God. He's talking to Israel here. You are the sons of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves nor shave your forehead for the sake of the dead. Hosea chapter 1 in verse 10, the prophet Hosea talks about sons of God. He says that the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered, and in the place where it is said to them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. So there's that passage as well. And then, of course, in the New Testament, it's a little more common in the New Testament, especially we think of Jesus' teaching in the Beatitudes, for instance. Matthew chapter 5 in verse 9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. One thing I think it's interesting to look at is in the Beatitudes, the parallels of what Jesus says here. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who are gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. They shall be satisfied. They shall receive mercy. They shall see God. They shall be called sons of God. When does all that happen? When Jesus comes back, when there's a resurrection. So there's a sense in which sons of God is a kind of a resurrection type event. It's kind of the happy ending to the story where he completes the adoption process. Now, which fits with what we read earlier in Luke 20. In the resurrection, they are like angels and are sons of God. Now, there are passages that suggest that we are now, presently even, sons of God. In Romans chapter 8, for instance, Romans chapter 8 and verse 14, for all who are being led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. And Galatians chapter 3 in verse 26, you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus, for all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. It's clear something here that sons of God doesn't just refer to any humans, it refers to a very specific kind of human. It refers to someone who is, actually been adopted as God's son, whether we're talking about Israel as his covenant people, whether we're talking about us as Christians, whether we're talking about us in a more fuller sense in the resurrection of the dead. And, of course, we have the same conclusion. Luke chapter 6 talks about we will be called sons of the Most High. There's more passages, but I think the bottom line is that if you go just based on what the phrase sons of God means, both views are actually possible. Now, I believe that the balance of the evidence tips towards these guys in Genesis 6 aren't really that righteous, and so therefore don't fit the human definition of sons of God. And so therefore, the other possible meaning would lead us to the angelic view. But you might not be convinced by that, and I'm admittedly biased, so move on. The other expression that's important is the phrase daughters of men. And does anybody know where else in the Bible the phrase daughters of men appears? It's a trick question. It doesn't appear anywhere else. There's no other place in the Bible where that phrase is used. Well, that's not very helpful. There are places in the Bible where the phrase sons of men is used, however, and what does that mean? Always means the same thing. It means human men. Sons of men means human men, right? And if we're going to do that, and we'll go based on that, why in the world would they say daughters of men instead of sons of men? Well, they're intended to restrict it to the female gender is probably the most likely reason. But it basically just means humans, or in this case, it would be human women. Now, why would you specify human women if the men are also human? Something to think about. Again, that's not a deadlocked piece of evidence, and I'm admittedly biased, but we'll leave it there for now. And then, all right, we got terminology, we got sons of God, we got daughters of men, which we don't have a lot of data to go off of there, admittedly. And then we got this third fun phrase, Nephilim. I'm just curious, does anybody's Bible say something other than Nephilim? Giants, right. Well, that's the most common view, and probably more or less. Do giants exist in the Bible? Well, yeah, they do, because, 1 Samuel 17, Goliath. We know that Goliath was 6.5 cubits, he was 6 cubits in a span, which is about 9.5 feet tall. I don't know very many 9.5 feet tall people. So we know giants exist. That's not what's at issue here. We also know that from Genesis 6, it says that these were the mighty men. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, which, you skip ahead a little bit. Numbers 13 mentions the Nephilim as well. In Numbers chapter 13 and verse 33, the Israelites come back from spying out the promised land, and they say, there also we saw the Nephilim. The sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim. We became like grasshoppers in our own sight, so we were in their sight. These are the giants in the land of Canaan, who they are so scared of, they refer to them as Nephilim. There are also a bunch of other words for giants in the Bible. That's why you have the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, and the Zamzamim, and you can read Deuteronomy for discussion about all of that. Joshua and Judges refer to the Anakim, which is one of these groups of giants, the sons of Anak, being defeated in the Promised Land. And There's a lot of texts in Joshua we could go to that mention them. But in Joshua chapter 11 says that Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. There were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel, only in Gaza, Gath, and in Ashdod some remain. And what do Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod all have in common? I know, it's a geography quiz, right? Gaza, Gath, Ashdod. They were all Philistine cities, all of them. Which, again, that's very, very sparse evidence that we're looking at there. But it's evidence nonetheless that giants existed in the land of Canaan. Israel destroyed them, and kind of by the end of that, they were only left in the Philistine areas. Now, I don't know why giants don't reproduce very much. Why they didn't become the dominant force in that area, but they didn't. And I couldn't answer why, more or less. But anyway, that's the most likely meaning for Nephilim. Some people don't think it means giants in Genesis 6, and they want to say it means like men of valor or men of renown, or when it says that the men of renown in Genesis 6 and verse 4, they want to say, oh, well, that's just people that were really mean tyrants, rulers, guys that were good at fighting. I don't know. Okay, that's possible. There's no lexical evidence for that, but that's possible. If you want to make a word mean something in this text that it doesn't mean anywhere else, you're welcome to it. And in this case, we don't actually have a lot of data to go on. So there you go. Again, I think the balance of the evidence tips in favor of them being giants, but I'm biased, so remember that. So that's what we got with terminology, more or less. Terminology doesn't rule out either view, strictly speaking. What about context? It's always important to keep context in mind, isn't it? We can always focus on that. And this is where the Seth-Cain approach really likes to kind of build their case from parallels. And so I'll just kind of tell the story that way. That they will argue the sons of God are descendants from the line of Seth, and the daughters of men are descendants from the line of Cain. And it's all built on this idea. In Genesis 3, you have the seed of woman versus the seed of the serpent. And chapter 4, you have Cain, who's obviously of the devil, and you have Abel, who is obviously the good guy in the story, but he gets killed. And so in 4:25, Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring, or literally another seed, in place of Abel. For Cain killed him. To him also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. And then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. So Seth apparently represents the righteous line of people. And of course, you have Cain's genealogy in chapter 4, you have Seth's genealogy in chapter 5, and that leads to this big explosion where the line of Seth and the line of Cain converge into this sons of God, daughters of men intermarriage that results in, apostasy. That's the basic storyline of the Seth-Cain view. Now, I can see the appeal to that, actually. And I might be tempted to kind of follow down that road. But there are some problems with that. Number one, of course, is it does imply that righteousness and wickedness are hereditary things. Are righteousness and wickedness hereditary things? Oh, well, if anything of our King's study has certainly kind of diffused that idea. It doesn't satisfactorily explain who the Nephilim are or what they have to do with anything. It doesn't explain why these sons of God, who are apparently so righteous and pure, are suddenly doing this wicked thing. And it doesn't explain why in the world these marriages are gender specific. Why is it that only the men from Seth and the women from Cain are the ones engaged in this? Why isn't there some mixture? They give their sons to their daughters, they give their daughters to their sons, they take their daughters as wives for their sons. That's usually the language of intermarriage in Hebrew scripture. But it's not really so two-directional here. It's one-directional, which is kind of interesting. Now, if you take the human view, but you don't take the Seth-Cain view, well, okay, you don't have that kind of parallel. I don't know what other elements from the context you would use to support that, actually. But Now, the angel's view can also claim parallels with other parts of Genesis too. So, I mean, you can find parallels for anything. Now, for example, the serpent deceived the woman in chapter 3. That's Satan, the evilest of all spiritual beings. And the sons of God seduced human women as well. So they're just kind of what Satan did in one area, they're now doing on a larger scale. The idea of Satan as a seducer comes up in the New Testament as well. The serpent's actions lead people to sin. The sons of God's actions lead to more sin. God condemns Adam and Eve. God condemns all of mankind. They're banished by God's presence. They're destroyed by God's flood. Even the language of Genesis 3 makes an appearance here. In Genesis chapter 3, Eve's sin is described in these terms in verse 6. And the woman she saw that the tree was good for food, that it was delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. She took from its fruit and ate. She gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. She saw it was good, and she took. That sums up all sin that ever takes place in the human race. We get the same thing going on in Genesis 6. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. The word there is actually good. It's the same word. They saw what was good, and they took. So, I mean, therein lies that parallel. That doesn't prove anything either way. That's kind of cool to notice. Ultimately, of course, the people raise questions against this as well. It is a very uncomfortable view of angels. Some people argue that this might negate man's free will if angels are coming and intermarrying with human women. And of course, there's always the question, how do you know that angels and humans mixing together would result in giants? Well, I don't know, because I've never set that up in a laboratory and looked at it for myself. It's a little difficult to do that, but again, I feel like that, just based on strict contextual parallels, you can make a case for both the human view, at least the Seth Cain view, and you can make a case for the angel's view. And you're both going to raise problems. You're both going to create cognitive dissonance with people. And again, I think the balance favors the angel's view. But I'm biased, so don't take my word for it. And that brings us through two sets of data: terminology, context. Anybody have any questions before I get into the New Testament stuff? We're not done yet. New Testament, if there's anything I believe that should help us understand a difficult Old Testament passage, it would be if that difficult Old Testament passage got quoted in the New Testament or referred to in the New Testament in some way that helped us explain it. For instance, there's some chronological problems figuring out the time difference between Abraham and the law. Guess what? Paul says there are 430 years between the promise to Abraham and the giving of the law in Galatians 3:17. I believe Paul. I'm going to take that seriously whenever I try to figure out Old Testament chronology. Or if Jesus comes along and says, well, that commandment in Deuteronomy about divorce, that's out of the hardness of the people's hearts. I'm going to take Jesus seriously when he says that. And I'm not going to assume from reading Deuteronomy 24 that God's okay with divorce, because Jesus says he's clearly not. And so, whatever the New Testament says when it's dealing with a specific passage ought to influence how we interpret it. Now, does the New Testament ever make reference to this story in Genesis 6? Well, there are three passages that are traditionally put forth, and I'll just kind of list them up here. There's 2 Peter 2, and I'll say 4 through 10. There's Jude 5 through 7, and less commonly, because the interpretation of this passage is also in dispute, 1 Peter 3 in verses 18 through 22. Now, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the 1 Peter 1 because that really kind of deserves its own lesson, and again, not everybody agrees on that. And your view on 1 Peter 3 people's views on 1 Peter 3 almost seems to go hand in hand with their view on this text in Genesis 6, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. But let's look at these passages in succession. All right, 2 Peter chapter 2. 2 Peter chapter 2. And I'm going to go ahead and start reading. The larger context is he's talking about false teachers and about judgment. And chapter 2, verses 4 through about halfway through verse 10 is a single sentence. Bear that in mind. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through about halfway through verse 10 is a single sentence. Bear that in mind. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through about halfway through verse 10 is a single sentence. Bear that in mind. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through about halfway through verse 10 is a single sentence. Bear that in mind. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through about halfway through verse 10 is a single sentence. Bear that in mind. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through about halfway through verse 10 is a single sentence. Bear that in mind. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through about halfway through verse 10 is a single sentence. Bear that in mind. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through about halfway through verse 10 is a single sentence. Bear that in mind. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 thro Verse 4, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness and reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter, and if he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, for by what he saw and heard that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment, especially those who indulge the flesh in its corrupt desires and despise authority." Now that's a mouthful of a sentence. So let's break it down a little bit. If God did this, then he knows how to do this. Specifically, if God rescued the godly and punished the wicked in the past, he knows how to do that today. That's what Peter's saying here in a nutshell. But he gives examples of wicked ones that got punished in the past and righteous ones who were delivered in the past. The 2 righteous people he mentions are Noah and Lot. And the wicked people he mentions, whom he didn't spare, are the angels when they sinned along with the ancient world, and the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I think that the parallelism is pretty hard to resist here. The angels that sinned were condemned while Noah was spared. The Sodom and Gomorrah were condemned while Lot was spared. Now, either we can say that Peter just brings up the fact that angels sinned and it's totally unrelated to everything else around it, or we can assume that what Sodom and Gomorrah is to Lot, the angels who sinned are to Noah. And we know from reading this passage, one thing we can't deny is that angels really did sin. That really happened. When did it happen? Peter gives a good hint that it happened in the days of Noah. Now that's not 100% conclusive deadlock. I will admit that. But I feel like it's really hard to ignore. If someone in the first century read 2 Peter, and they didn't have anything else in their hand, what would they say? Angels sinned in the past? When did this happen? Why am I just now hearing about this? Would they have thought that? Well, no, because every Jewish interpreter in the first century knew about this passage and took an angelic view of it. Their literature testifies to it. Now maybe the Jews were wrong, maybe Peter just brings up some totally unrelated event out here in left field where angels sin and has nothing to do with Noah or this passage or anything else. Maybe. But which of those ideas involves more assumptions? The one that says Peter's just simply quoting his Bible, or the one that says that there's this whole other backstory that we know nothing about that isn't even hinted to be a backstory that we know nothing about? I'll leave that to your judgment. But maybe you're still not convinced. Let's look at Jude. Jude, verses 5 through 7. And it's interesting what Jude does here. Jude has a lot of information that is in 2 Peter 2, although it's reworded and used in different ways. But it's sometimes instructive. And Jude talks about false teachers, and he appeals to 3 Old Testament examples. Jude really likes triplets. His examples are, verse 5, "I desire to remind you, though you know all things once for all, that the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. And angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they, in the same way as these, indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire." Now what happens here, there's 3 Old Testament examples. Israel in the wilderness, whom God destroyed. Angels who left their place, whom God put in chains. Sodom and Gomorrah, who indulged in sexual immorality, went after strange flesh, and now endure the penalty of eternal fire. But what's interesting is the little phrase he throws in. And he talks about the angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode. He's kept under bonds and darkness for the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these indulged in gross sexual immorality. In the same way as what? In the same way as some group of people he hasn't mentioned? Or in the same way as the angels whom he mentioned literally in the previous verse? Okay, that's an interesting way to word it, certainly. What's really interesting is, Sodom and Gomorrah is explicitly said to have engaged in gross sexual immorality. And if Jude doesn't intend to say that angels did the same thing, then he picked a really funny way to word it. In the same way. In the same way as the angels, Sodom and Gomorrah also committed gross sexual immorality, which hints that the sin that the angels were engaged in was sexual in nature. Now, somebody in the first century might have read Jude and said, well, angels sinned in the past? When did that happen? Why am I just now hearing about this? But the truth is that Jude himself later quotes from a Jewish work called 1 Enoch in verses 14 and 15. It was about these men that Enoch in the 7th generation from Adam prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds which they have done in an ungodly way and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. The only thing is that the book he's quoting from, 1 Enoch, has as its central storyline element the fact that angels showed up in the ancient world in the days of Noah and intermarried with human women and also taught them witchcraft and invented makeup and did other things like that. I'm not making that part up. They did invent makeup in 1 Enoch chapter 10. Regardless of whether you take 1 Enoch seriously, because it's a funny work. It probably wasn't written by Enoch since it's written so much later. But it's pretty hard to ignore the fact that Jude takes it seriously because he quotes it and calls it prophecy. It's pretty hard, and this is where the evidence is a little bit too much for me. It's pretty hard to imagine a scenario where Jude quotes 1 Enoch, but then doesn't expect his readers to associate the angels who sinned with the angels who sinned in 1 Enoch like 2 or 3 chapters later in the same book. Now, you may not think that's 100% deadlock. But again, the New Testament evidence kind of piles on top of itself. And there's no such compelling argument that can be made from the New Testament for the human view or for the Seth Cain view or from any of these other things. Okay. Now, 1 Peter 3, of course, 1 Peter 3 is embroiled in its own controversy because of the famous spirits in prison clause. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who once were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from flesh, but an appeal to God for good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers have been subjected to him. Now, there's 3 major views that circulate about this. One of them is the idea that Jesus descended into hell between his death and resurrection and proclaimed repentance to people who were wicked and they got a second chance. I don't know very many people who take that view or who even take that view very seriously, so I'm not going to deal with it. Another view, and this one is extremely common among brethren, is that it's about, and I'm pretty sure people here hold this view actually, it's about Noah preaching to wicked men in his day via the Spirit of Christ, and these men did not repent, and they became the spirits in prison after the fact. And then there's a third view, which is that this passage isn't about what happened. This passage isn't about Jesus preaching in the days of Noah. It's about Jesus making proclamation via his death, burial, and resurrection. And especially, in this case, over the evil spirits, essentially, or demons or fallen angels who disobeyed in the days of Noah. Now, a number of brethren like view number 1, a number of brethren like view number, I put the numbers out of order. A number of brethren like that second one, and a number of brethren like that third one, and, well, I mean, what we can say here, of course, is that, first of all, I'd say that the evil spirits approach better fits the context of 1 Peter because it fits into that theme of suffering and glory. You talk about Noah's preaching proclamation If it's Noah that's doing the preaching through the Spirit of Christ in this text, then it doesn't have much to do at all with resurrection or suffering or anything else that's in the book. By contrast, Christ's proclamation makes it a direct result. His suffering is followed by his glory and his proclamation of victory. Second, I would say that the phrase spirits is never actually used anywhere in our extant literature to refer to humans if it is unqualified. In other words, somebody doesn't just say spirits and expect you to understand humans. They're usually expecting you to understand it to mean spiritual beings. Third, follows the normal meaning of made alive. When Jesus is made alive in the Spirit, it doesn't mean he became a disembodied ghost. It means he was resurrected. That's what that word always means. Fourth, whenever he went and preached the spirits in prison, it's the same journey as when it says he had gone into heaven in verse 22. And finally, is the least awkward view of the expression in which. You have to do, if you're going to take the view that it was the Spirit of Christ preaching through Noah, you have to do a lot of chronological jumping back and forth to make in which mean something to the effect of in which spiritual realm. The only problem is there's much simpler views to take on that, like during which, or after which, or when. He was put to death in the flesh, made alive in the Spirit, during when he went and made proclamation of the Spirit's now in prison, after which he made proclamation of the Spirit's now in prison, or when, so there's a kind of, you could easily render it as temporal, and that actually makes the text a lot easier to read. That's the condensed version, and I know that was probably very, very fast and very dense, but what if that approach is correct and Peter is talking about evil spirits, what we know is, A, there were evil spirits, B, they were disobedient in Noah's day, C, they are now in prison, although prison is itself a translational choice. Regardless, now this part doesn't swing either way. I said that you can get either view out of terminology if you work at it. You can get either view out of context if you work at it. This you don't have to work at. And this really, it doesn't swing either way. The evidence is pretty overwhelming for the New Testament approach. And if you're not convinced at this point, well, I don't know what else to say on that point. There are some common objections that get made to the angel's view, and I want to talk about those in brief. First, naturally, somebody always brings up Matthew 22, which says angels can't marry. Well, in Matthew 22, Jesus is having an argument with the Sadducees. They go into this big, long, convoluted discussion about the one woman that's married to 7 different men in the resurrection. Whose wife is she? And Jesus answers and basically says that in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. Matthew 22 and verse 30. Again, Mark 12:25, when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And Luke's account, Jesus said to them, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that age in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot even die anymore because they are like angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. By the way, angels are called sons of God right there. And so the argument goes like this. Well, since Jesus said angels can't marry, Genesis 6 can't possibly be talking about angels marrying, so therefore the Bible can't be at odds with itself, so therefore checkmate. Well, not really. First of all, Jesus' words don't necessitate that interpretation. Jesus could simply be defining what the proper abode of angels is, which, if they did marry, they would be violating their proper abode. Ergo, they sinned. Ergo, that's why they're in chains of darkness. Jesus also says that angels don't die. Do angels get the second death? Well, yeah, we know that. We know that the hellfire is reserved for the devil and his angels. We know that the lake of fire and brimstone is a second death. But no one says that's a contradiction. Jesus says angels don't die, but there's a very real sense in which they will die when they're cast into the second death. But that's not considered a contradiction. So this shouldn't be considered a contradiction either. If Jesus were to use a phrase and say, well, men don't marry men, does that mean it's physically impossible for a man to marry another man? Well, it may not be physically impossible. Should he do it? No. It's a really bad thing. It's just wrong. And so the important thing, of course, is to realize that Matthew 22 and Mark 12 and Luke 20 are not intended to give a giant... Jesus doesn't stop in the middle of his argument with the Pharisees to explain the metaphysical rules of what angels can and cannot do. And, the basic point is, no, we're talking about resurrection. Just like marriage isn't normative for the angelic realm, marriage isn't normative when we're resurrected and become like angels. And just like death doesn't happen in the resurrection, marriage doesn't happen either. So, simply quoting Matthew 22 is not sufficient evidence to overturn the angelic view in Genesis 6. Another common argument, Jesus said, spirit does not have flesh and bones, Luke 24. Angels are spirits, Hebrews 1:14. Therefore, angels can't take human form. Yeah. Okay, well, if you think that, then that's fine and dandy, but you have to ignore every single place in the Bible where angels take human form. Like in Genesis 18, where Abraham meets men who eat and drink with him and they turn out to be angels. Or Genesis 19, where Lot meets two angels who eat and drink with him. Or when Jacob wrestles with an angel, kind of hard to do if you don't have a body. Or the angel who appears with a sword in his hand. I don't know where he got the hand if he doesn't take physical form. Or Judges chapter 2 describes an angel moving geographically from Gilgal to Bochim. Gideon encounters an angel who he mistakes for a human. Manoah and his wife encounter an angel that they call a man of God. Angel stands in the threshing floor and stretches out his hand against Jerusalem. 2 Samuel 24. 1 Kings 19, an angel touches Elijah and provides him with food. How does he touch him if angels aren't capable of touching people? And according to Hebrews even, it's possible that in showing hospitality to human strangers, we just might unknowingly entertain angels. Don't know when that happens. But, and those are just the examples where the word angel happens to be used, by the way. There's other words for angels in the Bible which can also be brought up in this issue. But if you believe the Bible, you cannot believe that angels are unchangeably incorporeal. You cannot believe they're incapable of taking human form because they do take human form all over the Bible. So that doesn't fly. Another objection, why would God punish the human race for the sins of angels? Good question. But it doesn't actually prove anything. One could just as easily rewind a little bit and ask, why does God punish the human race for the sins of Satan? The answer to that is he doesn't. He punishes humankind for their own sins, and mankind's certainly very good at racking up that total. Didn't need help. Now, spiritual beings can tempt mankind into sinfulness. We know that from reading Genesis 3. That does not absolve mankind of blame. And it's unlikely that the corruption introduced by wicked angels is the only contributing factor to the fact that God decided to destroy the entire world by flood. We know the Bible contains examples of things like demon possession. We also know Saul was tormented by an evil spirit but who's held accountable for Saul's sins? Well, Saul is, ultimately. Then, of course, there's the common, that's ridiculous, that could never happen, you're really reaching and speculating. I got a question for everyone who says that this idea is outlandish and ridiculous. Why is it that we have no problem believing that God created the world in 6 days, that light was created before the sun, that man was made from dirt, that woman was made from a rib, that serpents could talk, that humans were living for 900 plus years, that Noah fit 2 of every kind of animal on the ark, that the world got destroyed in a universal flood, and that the entire world used to speak one language? We believe all that. But angels, that's ridiculous. Who doesn't have enough faith now? Just saying. That's not getting into all the strange stuff people believe that isn't actually in Genesis, like the vapor canopy theory. But you know what? The world was different back then. And we weren't there. And we didn't see it happen. But you know what we can do? We can accept the little things that Scripture tells us. And we can accept it based on faith. So ultimately, we can't use just simple incredulity and say that's ridiculous, that could never happen. That's not a valid approach either. There's a bunch more possible objections we could get into. You know what? I'm just going to open the floor up and see, rather than spend all my time hashing out every possible little refutation. And you know what? You may still not be convinced. Okay, that's fine. You don't have to be convinced by all of this. But I mean, I feel like that's as strong of a case as can be made for that interpretation. So I'm more than happy to hear other thoughts or objections, or just, Wayne, you've totally missed this passage here. You know. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, actually. I didn't get to some of those passages. But Psalm 82, I think, is one passage that comes to mind in reference to this. Psalm 82, speaking about the judges of the earth, God takes his stand in his congregation, and he starts condemning these unjust judges. And he says in verse 6, I said you are gods, and you are all sons of the Most High. Nevertheless, you will die like men and fall like any one of the princes. It's kind of weird that he calls them gods there. And people kind of scratch their heads and go, why does he refer to human judges as gods? Jesus quotes that in the New Testament, by the way, in John chapter 10. There's instances, the idea who is the Son of God is actually a sermon in and of itself, by the way. I mean, Israel collectively is called God's son. David and his descendants are called God's sons. It's really quite a fascinating story, of which I think angels are ultimately just one part of that story. It's not just it's not singularly restricted to that ultimately. But those are some ideas to look at. There's also an idea in the Old Testament that angels were kind of given, how do I put it, administration over the nations. And Daniel deals with that subject a lot when it talks about the prince of the kingdom of Persia and the prince of Greece and Michael and how they're all disputing with one another. But also Deuteronomy chapter 32 deals with this as well, this angelic situation. In Deuteronomy 32 and verse 8, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, he separated the sons of men, he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of God. Now some versions say sons of Israel there, which there's a whole textual dispute I don't want to get into. But one of the readings of Deuteronomy 32 is that God separates the nations according to the sons of God. He kind of leaves the angels as these sort of administrators. And then of course there's a much more elaborate view that's built on that they were, many of them were corrupt in their administration and tried to become demigods that the people would worship. Now what you think of that, I don't know. I know that Paul said the Gentiles were sacrificing to demons and not to God. I know that Deuteronomy 32 says something very similar. So do spiritual beings influence man for bad even after the flood? Yeah, they do. Do spiritual beings influence man for bad even today? We are still in a struggle with the spiritual forces of wickedness. Now, we may not have this business going on, and we may not have people being bona fide possessed by demons where they can rip chains off themselves. But there's something going on behind the curtain that we can't see. And that I think, every time we look at a text like this, we are kind of getting a glimpse into what's going on behind the scenes. Anything else? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Well, Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of argument that's made about how to translate Nephilim. And, ultimately, again, one of the things we do see here, and it brings us back to a point that we can agree on, is that the earth was really, really corrupt back then. Something got messed up along the way. And the Lord basically said to mankind, enough of this. You got 120 years, which it probably refers to the time until the flood, not the future lifespan of mankind. You got 120 years, that's it. That's your deadline. Interesting that God gives them a deadline. Now, ultimately, what can we learn from this? Well, some basic lessons that even if you don't agree with the angelic view, you can agree with this. First, that God will judge His sons if they forsake Him. We know that for a fact. I mean, angels are called sons of God elsewhere in the Bible. We know that God judges them. How much more us, who are now adopted as sons of God? We're not faithful to Him. There's a judgment for us too. Peter and Jude make that point. If God didn't spare the angels when they sinned, what makes you think He'll spare you? What makes you think He'll spare false teachers? What makes you think He'll spare the heretics, the divisive people? God knows how to judge. And consequently, the reverse of that is also true. God knew how to save then. He knows how to save now. The second lesson is, I think we can truly appreciate how Christ, the Son of God, is greater than all these sons of God. He's greater than these angels. He's greater than these unclean spirits because they've been subjected to Him once and for all. 1 Peter 3:22 talks about how angels and authorities and powers have been subjected to Him. Christ's enemies have been made a footstool for His feet, and He will continue ruling from heaven until that last enemy, death, gets defeated and subjected to Him. Man, his sinful world was corrupted a long time ago by evil spirits, by the devil himself. And that sinful world put Christ to death. But God didn't let flesh have this final say. He made Him alive in the Spirit. He raised His Son from the dead, issued a declaration of victory, reminded Satan, your days in this world are numbered. And thirdly, I think we have a deeper appreciation for what it means that God really does give all people everywhere a chance to become His sons. In love, Ephesians says, He predestined us to adoption as sons. The fact that God gave us the chance to be called His children, that's the ultimate manifestation of His love. And we know that some people, they were His sons, they didn't handle it well. They forsook that. But we know there's a time coming when we're going to see God as He is. Even though it's not yet appeared as what we will be. And now, right now, we can take comfort in knowing that God gave His rebellious creation a second chance. He gave us a chance to be adopted as sons. A chance to succeed even when the angels failed and fell into darkness. You can make the argument that God doesn't give the angels a chance at repentance at all. He just cast them into hell. They had greater accountability. They should have known better. They were in the presence of God. But for us, He gives something that He doesn't give to them. It's a chance of repentance. We have a living hope. We have a motivation that comes from that. To serve Him to the best of our ability until the day when that fullest potential, that relationship is realized and we are truly sons of God forever. Those are just some basic lessons I think that we can get from that. And again, I hope that this has been thought-provoking in some way or beneficial. Of course, like I said before, don't take my word for it. I'm biased. Instead, study the Scriptures for yourself. Come to your own conclusion. This is what I believe is reasonable to conclude from the Scriptures based on that. It's not something, I don't feel like this is an opinion. I do feel like this is a conclusion that's been reached through logic. But I can make mistakes too. I can be flawed. And so, like any issue, I would encourage you to be like the Bereans. Examine the Scriptures to see if these things are in fact so. And see if these things make sense. And, if you feel I have erred and you have some reason why, I would love to hear it. I would love to continue growing in my knowledge of the truth. Of course, we're here tonight, and this lesson doesn't lend itself easily to an invitation of sorts. But if you're here tonight and your relationship as a son of God, a child of God, is not in the place that it needs to be, well, now is an appropriate time to let that be known and to make your life right with the Lord while together we stand and we sing the song selected.